Hello everyone, this is Group 5, and here are my group mates Fan Royale, Dai Jiale, Tian Miaoqing, and me, Huang Mingjie. So in this group postcast, we explore the synthesis voices and identity in post-radio context by examining how people's voices and identities are shaped by the radio history, power, relations, and social structures. In post-colloquial studies, voices is not only about the speaking, but also about who's heard it and whose stories are valued. While an identity is shaped by factors such as the culture, migration, gender, and the power. So the different theoretical perspectives is our discussion highlights how voices and identities are continuously negotiated in the post-colonial societies.
Hello everyone, in this podcast I would like to explore the concept of Orientalism proposed by Edward Said, explain how I understand this idea, illustrate it through Dash Owl's The Harmony Silk Factory, and finally reflect on what it still matters in today. To begin with, when we read novels, watch films, or even follow international news, we rarely stop to ask a very basic question. Who is actually telling the story? This is precisely the question Edward Said raises through his theory of Orientalism. In Orientalism, published in 1978, Said explained that Orientalism is not simply about negative stereotypes of the East, but about power over representation. Historically, the West has described the East as exotic, mysterious, backward, or irrational, while presenting itself as modern, rational, and objective. What makes this powerful is that these descriptions are largely produced by Western voices and institutions, meaning that Eastern societies were spoken about rather than allowed to speak for themselves. In other words, Orientalism is about who holds the microphone and whose voice is treated as knowledge. And what stands out to me most about Orientalism is how clearly it links representation to voice. Set does not ask us to simply judge whether these images of the East are accurate or inaccurate. Instead, he pushes us to ask a more revealing question. Who is allowed to speak and who is being spoken for? When one group repeatedly speaks on behalf of another, the people being represented slowly lose control over their own stories. They become objects to be explained, interpreted, or even corrected, rather than individuals with their own perspectives. Seen this way, Orientalism helps us understand that silence in representation is not accidental. It is often the result of unequal power relationships that decide which voices sound authoritative and which voices are ignored. The idea becomes much clearer when we turn to Dash Out's The Harmony Silk Factory. The novel centers on Johnny Lin, yet interestingly, Johnny never tells his own story. Instead, we meet him through the memories and words of others, especially Jasper, a British expatriate. Jasper's narration presents Johnny as mysterious, charismatic, and almost mythical, turning him into an object of fascination. This reflects an Orientalist way of seeing, where the Eastern subject is romanticized and simplified to fit Western expectations. At first, Jasper's account feels convincing, not necessarily because it is truthful, but because his voice carries authority. However, when the narrative later shifts to Snow's perspective, cracks begin to appear. Snow reveals contradictions, silences, and missing details in Jasper's story. showing that Johnny's identity has been shaped by selective storytelling. Through these conflicting narratives, the novel gently but clearly challenges the idea that one voice can fully present another person's life, especially when power differences are involved. In this way, the Harmony Silk Factory does not just tell a story, it exposes how stories are constructed and controlled. What is striking is that this pattern is not limited to colonial history or literary texts. If we look at the world today, similar dynamics are still at work. In global media and political discussions, certain regions, especially in Asia and the Middle East, are often described through simplified narratives that focus on difference, danger, or tradition. These stories are frequently told from outside perspectives, while the voices of people from those regions remain marginal. Whether in discussions about mitigation, conflict, or global crises, we often hear explanations about communities rather than listening to them. This shows that the question raised by Orientalism, who gets to speak and who gets heard, is still deeply relevant in the contemporary world. Okay, in conclusion, Orientalism offers a powerful way to understand how voice, identity, and power are connected. By first understanding the theory, then reflecting on its meaning, and finally seeing how it appears in the harmonious factory and in current global issues, we can clearly see that representation is never neutral. When dominant voices control narratives, others are simplified or silenced. Perhaps the most important insight Orientalism gives us is not just to question what is being said about the world, but to listen carefully to who is speaking and who is being spoken for, and last but not least, whose voices are still missing. When you watched here, that's all my podcast. I want to highlight that representation is never neutral. Who speaks matters, and that's all I want to talk about.
Okay, so when we talk about knowledge, we often assume that knowledge is objective, universal, and natural. We tend to believe that facts speak of themselves and that knowledge exists independently from power or identity. However, in Anzadua's Borders, fundamentally challenges this assumption. She shows us that knowledge is never natural. Instead, it is always shaped by power, identity, and borders. If we approach Anzadur's work from the perspective of epistemology, is that the study of how knowledge is produced and validated, we can see that she is asking two central questions. First, who has the authority to produce and define knowledge? And second, how do borders determine which voices are considered legitimate and which are dismissed? So for Anzador's border is never just a physical line on a map. Although she writes about the US-Mexico border, she makes it clear that borders also exist at cultural, linguistic, racial, gendered, and psychological levels. One of her most famous descriptions of the border is an open wound, a space where different worlds are collided and bleed. This metaphor is important because it shows that borders are not natural divisions. They are sites of violence, hierarchy, and power. From an epistemological perspective, borders function as filters of knowledge. They determine what is seen as rational and what is emotional. So what counts as academic knowledge and what is reduced to personal experience, and whose perspectives are treated as universal versus marginal as a result. People who live on the border are often positioned as unreliable knowers. Their voices are heard but not taken seriously. So this is exactly what Anzador seeks to challenge in dominant Western epistemological traditions. Legitimate knowledge is usually expected to be objective, detached, and expressed in standardized language. Knowledge that comes from institutions rather than lived experience is given more authority. And that duo directly rejects this hierarchy. He insists that lived experience itself is a valid and powerful source of knowledge. Throughout Borderlands, she writes from the body, from memory, from pain, and from cultural history. She makes the critical claim that the body itself is a site of knowledge. So this challenged the traditional Western separation between mind and body, suggesting instead that knowing is embodied, emotional, and deeply connected to identity. Language plays a crucial role in this argument. One of the most striking features of Borderlands in Azador's constant movement between English, Spanish, Chicano Spanish, and indigenous language in dominating academic and social contexts. Mixed or non-standard language is often viewed as incorrect, unprofessional, or illegitimate. Azador exposed how this linguistic hierarchy becomes a way of controlling whose knowledge counts. At one point, she declares that she will no longer feel ashamed of existing. This statement is not only personal, but epistemological. It is a refusal to accept the idea that not only certain languages are capable for producing the knowledge. By writing in multiple languages and refusing to translate everything for the dominant reader, Azador asserts that authority of border language. Language itself becomes a form of epistemological resistance. So to conclude, Borderlands that knowledge is not naturally produced at the center and merely discovered by others. Instead, it is consistently challenged and reshaped by those at the margins. And Zador makes it clear that who owns knowledge is never a natural question, and that borders play a central role in deciding which voices are heard and which are dismissed. So at the same time, she reminds us that border is not a space of silence. On the contrary, it is a space of epistemological resistance, where new ways of knowing, speaking, and understanding the world are created. So that's all for my part. Thank you.
Hello everyone, my name is Huang Mingjie, and in this postcard I will talk about the context of diaspora and how it affects our identity and voices in context. As a part of our group discussion on voices and the identity, diaspora helps us understanding how people experience belonging and self-experience after migration and displacement. Diaspora does not simply mean moving from one country to another. Instead, it describes a long-term conditions of living away from one's place of origin with while still feeling emotionally and communicate culturally contacting to do it. People in diaspora often live between different cultures, languages, and the social experiences. Because of that, their sense of belonging is often unstable. One key feature of the diaspora is identified under unconscious. Diasporic individually may feel that they no longer fully belonging to their homeland, but they are also not completely accepted in the homeless society. As a result, identity becomes flexible rather than fixed. Instead of having one clear identity, people in diaspora often develop the mixed or hybrid identities shaped by different cultural influences. This unstable sense of belonging can be explained through the Benedict Anderson's ideas of imagined communities. Anderson defined the nation as an imagined political community, and imagined it as a born inhibitions limited and solutions. By using the word imagined, Anderson does not mean that the nations are fake. Rather, he explains that people feeling connections to others in a nation through the same stories, symbols, and ideas, even if they never meet each other. Anderson also pointed out that members of even the smartest nation will never know most of their foreign members, meet them, or even heard of them. Yet in the mind of each lives the imagine of their communications. These stories that national belonging experience meaning in people's imagination rather than in direct personal relationships. For people in the diaspora, this created tensions. Even after leaving their homeland, they may still imagine themselves as a part of that national communities. However, in everyday lives, they are often treated as outside. Because of this, their senses of belonging become individually. They feel emotionally connected to imagined communities, but society distant from it. These divisions strongly affect voices. In post-colonial context, voices is not only about the speaking, but also about being heard and recognized. The particular individual may find that their voices do not fit nearly into the dominant national narratives. Their experience can be ignored, misunderstood, or simplified, which makes it harder for them to experience their identity fully. Languages also plays an important role. Many people in diaspora move between different languages. Speaking the dominant languages may help them communicate it, but it can also create feelings of cultural loss. On the other hand, using their mother tongue may limit their acceptance in the host society. This shows that the voices in diaspora is often shaped by power rather than the personal choices. In conclusion, diaspora helps us understand how identified and the voices are shaped by the displacement and belonging. Through the entrance concept of imagining the communities, we can see why people in diaspora often experience uncertain identity and fragmented voices. The diploma does not scientize people completely, but it makes identity and self-experience more complex in the post-colonial societies.
Hello everyone, today I will talk about the post-colonial feminism using the two novels, Things Fall Apart and Harmony Silk Factory. This discussion is part of our group theme, Voice and Identity in Post-Colonial Context. The main question I want to explore is who can speak and who is heard, especially when we talk about women in the post-colonial society. And post-colonial feminism focuses on the experiences of women in the society that were once colonized. It argues that women in those contexts face more than one kind of pressure. They are affected not only by the gender inequality but also by colonial history, cultural traditions, and social structures. And because of this, their experiences are very different from those of women in the Western society. And post-colonial feminism also challenges some Western feminist ideas. Western feminism sometimes assumes that all women face similar problems. However, post-colonial feminism reminds us that women in colonized or post-colonized cities often live under very specific historical and cultural conditions. Their voices are often ignored, not only by men in their own society, but also by dominant narratives that try to speak for themselves instead of listening to them. In Things Fall Apart, we can clearly see how women's voices are limited within a patriarchal society, and the story mainly focuses on the Okunko, a male character who represents the strength and authority. In this world, women are expected to be silent, and female characters such as Okunko's wives, they rarely experience their own perspective. They are mainly shown as wives, mothers, and workers. And the author writes that Okunko ruled his household with a heavy hand, and that his wife lived in a fear of his temper. And this fear creates silence inside the family. And one clear example is when Okunko beat his second wife for cutting a few leaves from a tree. During this scene, the other wives can only back him from a distance, saying it's enough for Okunko. They cannot stop him or openly challenge his authority. This shows that women's silence is not a personal choice, but the result of power and fear. And from a post-colonial feminism perspective, this reveals how women are already marginalized with traditional social structures, and when colonial influence enters the society, the situation doesn't not improve for the women. Although colonialism brings a new system, women remain marginalized. They are caught between the traditional patriarchy and the colonial power. And in the Harmony Silk Factory, women lack a public voice in a different way. Female characters are often spoken about rather than speaking for themselves. Snow's diary is important because it shows that writing is her only space of expressions, and in the public, the male-dominated colonial world, her thoughts carry little weight, and Snow realizes that power belongs to the man. They make decisions and control authority, while she remains outside the circle. Even though she is present, she is not included. And this shows how women's voices are limited through the gender, social position, and colonial structures working together. And although the settings are different, both novels reveal a similar pattern. Women experience multiple forms of oppression at the same time, and they are limited by the patriarchy in their own cultures and shaped by the colonial history and power. Their identities are formed under the force they cannot fully control. And this brings us back to the key questions. Who can ask and who is heard? Post-colonial feminism helps us understand that silence is often structured, and some voices are allowed to be central, while others are pushed to the margin. Women are not silent because they have nothing to say, but because they are not given space to speak. So through the two novels, we can see how women's voices are excluded from the dominant narratives. Post-colonial feminism does not try to speak for these women. Instead, it asks why they have been denied the space to speak for themselves. So in conclusion, post-colonial feminism helps us see the voice and identity are not equally shared in post-colonial context. Women's experiences are shaped by gender, culture, and colonial history. By paying attention to those whose voices are missing, we can better understand the power, identity, and economic in post-colonial society. That's all from me. Thank you.